Focus Area 1, AITSL Standard 3.6, demonstrate broad knowledge of strategies that can be used to evaluate teaching programs to improve student learning. My main pedagogical approach to ensure I was meeting the specific needs of the students and to improve their learning was performing some sort of pre-test or prior knowledge activity, which included a short quiz on time, or in this case, writing a narrative to determine what students know about structure. Focusing on the narrative, I displayed some images of doors on the whiteboard for students to gain inspiration for what to write about. Ensuring the narrative included a door was part of the criteria of the task. Once completed, I read through the students' work to determine where to start my unit. I chose to begin with teaching orientation, as I could see that was where most students had a main deficit. After 6 weeks, I ran the same activity again and discovered the students could now introduce characters, setting, and a time frame, as well as use paragraphs to organise their work. By looking at this student's work displayed, you can see that in the first activity, the student lacked structure and the correct information that a narrative requires. After the 6-week unit, I have taught students how to use paragraphs and how to follow the correct structure of the narrative. I believe by doing this, I was successful in evaluating their abilities and tailoring a unit plan to meet their needs, which improved student learning. Focus Area 2, AITSL Standard 4.2, demonstrate the capacity to organise classroom activities and provide clear directions. With the support of my supervising teacher, we collaboratively created a plan to implement guided reading as a part of our morning literacy block. We used data from running records to develop the guided reading groups and allocated each group activities based upon their needs. In the first week, the students were sat down and explicitly run through the expectations of these rotations and what each activity would entail. This included introducing signals for when students need to go to the toilet or to get a drink, so that groups weren't being interrupted when reading and working on their comprehension strategies. I also helped work with a group on sight words or comprehension tasks to get them used to running through them with their partners before gaining my own guided reading group. In the weeks following, students were briefly run through the activities and could refer to the whiteboard if they were confused or stuck at any point, to ensure more time was being spent on learning. I feel as though the rotations worked really well. The students were all engaged in the activities at all times, and it's something I would like to implement into my future classroom to promote independence in the students who aren't working with the teacher for the day. Focus Area 3, demonstrate understanding of assessment and moderation and its application to support consistent and comparable judgments of student learning. At the beginning of teaching my narrative unit, my supervising teacher and I discussed how I would assess the students' work. I discussed using a rubric to mark it against when it was suggested that we create the rubric collaboratively with the students to ensure they were aware of my expectations for when they write a narrative. We spent 15 minutes of an assessment lesson discussing the rubric and by asking them open-ended questions based upon the emojis. For example, what do you think would make me happy to see in your narrative? And what do you think I'd be sad about if I didn't see it in your narrative? This prompted discussion and about my expectations. When it came to marking the narratives, it was easy to identify the students who had fully grasped the concepts by highlighting their successes on the rubric. This is something I would do in my own classroom, however, I would not do it for every unit. I would identify learning intentions and success criteria at the beginning of each unit to ensure the students were aware of my expectations to help them succeed in their assessment task. Focus Area 4, demonstrate the AITSL Standard 5.4, demonstrate the capacity to interpret student assessment data to evaluate student learning and modify teaching practice. When my supervising teacher and I were planning the guided reading groups, we viewed and analysed running record data to help us determine the groups of students would be placed in to ensure we were meeting their individual needs. The groups were organised with students who had a similar ability level in reading to develop goals that would be relevant and realistic to their individual needs whilst being supported by teachers and their peers. In Term 2, the higher groups focused on comprehension strategies, while the lower groups focused on sight, words, or oral language activities. By organising the students into these groups, I was able to identify the need to modify my teaching practices by observing the students in a small group setting, by being able to work with various groups throughout the week. I was also able to observe and monitor progress in student learning. In my future practices, I would use this type of data set to create my own reading groups to ensure that students' learning is benefiting from their peers and support from myself. Focus Area 5, AITSL Standard 5.5. Demonstrate understanding of a range of strategies for reporting to student and parents or carers and the purpose of keeping accurate and reliable records of student achievement. There are multiple pedagogical approaches that teachers can use to assess student achievement to report upon. Whilst I was on placement, I identified two main strategies I wanted to incorporate into assessing student learning, which was the use of a rubric and an observation checklist. The rubric was used for my narrative unit to identify if students could apply the strategies that they have been taught throughout the unit in a creative writing assessment task. By reading through their work and highlighting the relevant box, I was able to identify what students were performing above, at, or below the expected standard of work, as according to the Australian Curriculum Achievement Standards. The observation checklist was used to efficiently assess the skill development of students at the conclusion of the soccer unit that I taught. By using this checklist, I was able to place students into small groups and assess them based upon the criteria: exceeding, well-developed, developing, and emerging. These strategies are two that I plan on implementing in my own practice when assessing the learning of my own students. The reasoning behind this is due to the simplicity of the assessment framework and ease of data analysis when it comes to reporting student achievement to parents and carers. Focus Area 6, AITSL Standard 6.3. Seek and apply constructive feedback from supervisors and teachers to improve teaching practices. As a graduate teacher, it is important to seek feedback from my supervising teacher regarding my practice, lesson content, and pedagogies to be able to make adjustments and improvements. Using the provided UniSA mentor-teacher template, at least one lesson a day was supervised and provided feedback upon, which we discussed in our non-instructional time or at the conclusion of the day. We use this time to set goals and plan how I can achieve these. These goals would be reviewed at the end of each week, and we would discuss whether or not I had met it or how I can adjust my pedagogy to meet them. In future practices, I imagine that I will be observed again by mentors or leadership in schools who will also provide feedback. I would also provide them with a similar observation sheet to ensure that I am meeting the needs of the lesson and the school context.